American Freefall.
U.S. President Joe Biden admits that the U.S. is falling far behind other countries in infrastructure and childcare. Meanwhile, it's spending 40% of the world's entire expenditure on defense on its military.
History shows that no country stayed on top forever. 100, 200 years is the max, and then they peak and go into decline. So I presume we're no different from anybody else. But one of the problems with history is people don't learn the lessons of history. We had a president recently who didn't know history, or if he did know history, he said he was smarter than history. I know I'm not smarter than history, and history is very clear. No nation and no currency, by the way, because they sometimes go hand in hand, has stayed on top forever. So America is now the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. We have troops in over 100 countries. There are people who would say that we're overextended financially, economically, militarily, and it looks like they might be right. I worry. It's not a good time to be young in America because what the young people are going to inherit is mind-boggling.
Hello and welcome everyone to We the People. I'm your host, Daniel Arya, and in this episode, we'll discuss Joe Biden's economic proposals and how he acknowledges that the U.S. is not in a suitable position anymore. We'll also speak about the reasons of the U.S. decline and reiterate how massive spending on the military is taking its toll on other segments of the country. Stay tuned.
The rest of the world is starting to out-educate us. Early education is earlier and more prevalent in European countries. A significant number we rank number 34 out of 37 industrial nations in the world, and the number of where we rank in terms of people getting a degree beyond high school.
Now, Joe Biden had also said a few days before the previous announcement that the U.S. infrastructure has fallen from the best in the world and now ranks 13th in the world, and America is also behind in investing in early childhood education and care. Biden has stressed that the world is catching up and beginning to pass us. Our first guest is Dr. William Black, the professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and also a lawyer and author. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you for the invitation. It's good to speak again with you.
Now, Dr. Black, tell us, so why is America falling behind the rest of the planet?
Because the United States, if it were a race, would be the one driving or riding the 12-year-old horse with bad teeth and going, well, it keeps getting me around the track. Why do I need to worry whether I'm at the front of the pack or the back of the pack? In other words, we haven't tried. And if you don't try, you fall farther and farther behind.
Thank you for joining us, Professor Black from the state of Missouri.
It seems that the problems in the United States are far more severe than Biden is letting on. For example, a report from the Harvard School of Public Health revealed in 2019 that more than 40% of schools in America that sampled their water turned up that their water contains too much lead. This is while most are not even testing for it. The report goes on to state that there is no safe level of lead and that it causes irreversible nerve damage and permanently damages the brains of babies and children.
The economy is, first, it's never been this way. So it's, from an economic perspective, unknown. What I mean by that is these supply chain shortages and bottlenecks. We've never seen anything like them. And what the world went to over the last 30 years is called just-in-time inventory, which means there's very little extra inventory. And so if there is a shortage, it can shut things down very rapidly. And then people bid up the price because it's so short. And so you're seeing these particular areas of inflation, but also particular areas where you can't, for example, build a car unless you have all the components. And so if even one necessary component isn't there, it's going to slow down production. At the same time that's happening, we have record numbers of people that regained employment over the last 8 months. So, the economy is complicated.
Now, 2 years later, a report showed that 91% of Pennsylvania schools that tested drinking water found lead, but only 9% removed it. In climate change, Biden is facing mounting pressure from environmental activists to pass a bill to help reverse climate change. But the bill is not only opposed by the Republicans, but also from some Democrats, like Joe Manchin III.
Manchin, who is a senior U.S. Senator from West Virginia, is also a businessman whose interests include founding the coal brokerage EnerSystems and has made millions of dollars from his coal company. Now, the coal industry may be hurt by the bill, which tries to reduce gas emissions. This is while at the same time U.S. power plants are on track to burn 23% more coal this year, which is the first increase since 2013.
Whole idea that when you have a sovereign currency, you fund things through taxation is not correct. But you are also correct that the extreme rich in the United States are taxed after the Trump tax cuts in particular, but even before, at an exceptionally low rate compared to many countries. And during the pandemic, they have added over $3 trillion in wealth to a very tiny number of families, less than 1,000, have added over $3 trillion in wealth.
So Joe Biden is trying to pass legislation for his domestic agenda. The Build Back Better budget reconciliation bill is one of 2 huge pieces of legislation. The other bill is focused on infrastructure. Build Back Better focuses on a list of social policies from education to healthcare, from housing to climate. Program includes publicly funded preschool programs, free community college for 2 years, expanded Medicare services and Medicaid, lower prescription drug costs, housing investments, tax cuts for electric vehicles, and other climate incentives. Our second guest is Mike Harris, journalist and commentator. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, Mr. Harris, tell us, U.S. infrastructure, it's in shambles. Why?
On the matter of why our infrastructure is falling behind, that's plain and simple. That is simple corruption. There's so much theft and pandering and just, malfeasance on the part of our government officials, where they're not doing the jobs that they're paid to do. There may be a contract for a bridge go out or for a highway project go out or something, and they try to seek the lowest bidder. A lot of times when you get the lowest bidder, you get the lowest quality. And they've been neglecting these projects for years and years and years. Our bridges are falling apart. Our airports are falling apart.
Thank you for joining us on our program, Mr. Mike Harris.
The bill does not include universal health care or any provisions for student loan debt forgiveness. The average student loan debt owed in the U.S. is $37,693. There are also no additional increases in Social Security, federal assistance for the poor, elderly, and disabled either. The cost of these bills are supposed to be covered by new tax plans, but with the opposition of 2 Democratic senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Sinema of Arizona, the fate of these bills are unknown. The bill would cost $3.5 trillion over 10 years. Manchin and Sinema want a much smaller cost. Manchin had suggested $1.5 trillion. The White House and Democrats are trying to decrease the costs so they would be able to pass the bill by the end of October.
Very strong policy reasons for taxing people in terms of equality in that sense. And this is where you have to remember how narrow the margin is. In other words, it's tied in the Senate between Democrats and Republicans. And in our system, for most purposes, that means the vice president could break the tie, and the vice president, of course, is a Democrat. But if that means every single Democratic senator has a veto power over this kind of legislation. And two of our Democratic senators are exercising that veto power, and they are exceptionally protective of the extreme wealthy.
A recent piece in The Hill, that's a U.S. media outlet out of the Capitol there, explains that the cost of the legislation for small businesses and ordinary Americans are too real, and that it would be paid for by the biggest tax increases in generations. According to U.S. Chamber of Commerce, over 1.4 million small businesses employing almost 13 million Americans would pay higher taxes and would see it rise by 26%. Now, small companies structured as pass-throughs would see their access to the 20% small business tax reduction plan dramatically curtailed and would face other tax hikes.
California has a 51 cent per gallon gasoline tax. Arizona, my state, has a 19 cents a gallon gasoline tax. New York has a 27 cents a gallon gasoline tax. Where does this money go? No one seems to know. It's supposed to go to improve the highways and the roads and bridges, and yet every year the roads and bridges are worse and worse. So there is no accountability, and I blame it on corruption within our government and failure to act on the behest of the American people in protecting their best interest. Instead, these politicians line their pockets. We see so many politicians who come into office with very, very little money, and they retire as multimillionaires. How is this possible? It's flat out corruption in the U.S. system. That's plain and simple.
Now, while the government is scrambling to pass these bills, a Pew Research Center poll found that from July to September, Biden's approval rating fell by 18 points among black voters, 16 points among Hispanics, and 12 points among women. He won all three groups with high margins last year. His approval ratings among Democrats fell by 13 points, and his approval among independents that contributed significantly to his election fell from 54 to 42%.
Look at poverty, and let's be straight here. We look at the war on poverty that was initiated by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. We've spent since then, as of 2015, $23 trillion on the war on poverty, and yet there's more poverty than ever in this country. It's a number of things. One of them is that these programs that they have, the welfare programs, the welfare system, how the system is constructed, is not effective. It hasn't been effective at all. What the Democrat Party primarily has done with this policy is to build themselves a poverty constituency that will always vote for the Democrats because they will support increases in welfare and other poverty programs. These programs plain don't work, and they never have. You compound this and make it worse by what Bill Clinton did by passing NAFTA, GATT, and letting China in the WTO. When U.S. jobs were offshored, we were promised by Mr. Clinton that whenever he did these things, that we were going to replace those low-wage, dirty manufacturing jobs with high-wage knowledge worker jobs. Here we are 20 plus years later, and those knowledge worker jobs still have not yet appeared.
Experts believe that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the COVID pandemic, and Democratic infighting over Joe Biden's domestic agenda are the main reasons for his colossal setback. 92% of African American voters had voted for Biden in the 2020 election, but now only 67% of them actually approve of his job.
Two of these Democrats in the Senate want to wreak havoc on the Biden agenda in particular. And so, for example, the Democrats are talking up the fact that the bill would reduce childhood poverty by half, which is, of course, a very good thing. But the obvious question is, who would design a bill that would leave half the children in poverty? And these two senators don't want to take even half of the children of America out of poverty. So that's quite insane. And those would be the primary effects in the two areas of child and health care and in terms of dealing with global climate disruption.
Okay, so as the opposition grows over the cost of Joe Biden's main legislation, the U.S. spends trillions of dollars to invade other countries throughout the world and keep its military bases abroad while its own country is suffering from poverty, homelessness, unemployment, a broken down infrastructure, and cannot seem to find a way to pay for the people's needs except by increasing taxes.
Because the U.S. primarily works on a military economy. We have never stopped being on a wartime economy since World War II. You can witness this with the war in Korea. We didn't win. The war in Vietnam, we didn't win. Afghanistan and Iraq, we didn't win. The military needs more money every year because they're beholden to the military contractors and shareholders, that these contractors need ongoing state of war, and they need more money every year to increase their profits and their bottom line in order to appease their shareholders so that they can get their bonuses and that. We have a revolving door. Generals and colonels leave the military and go directly to work for the military contractors afterwards. That is why the military every year consumes more and more money.
The American people, especially in the African American and Hispanic communities, are suffering from much needed investment, especially with the rise of unemployment due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The health system in the country is crumbling, and ordinary people are not able to afford health care. The minorities in the U.S. are the ones who are dying disproportionately from COVID-19.
The U.S. has corruption that is rampant, and the system is not sustainable. We're essentially run by a criminal enterprise at this point in time. Any vestiges of our Constitution have been stripped away. The lobbyists, the money that's spent on that, the way campaigns are financed, all of it. It truly is a tragedy what has been allowed to happen to the United States.
Now, the U.S. defense budget this year is more than $700 billion, which is almost 40% of all military spending in the world and more than the budget of the highest spending 11 countries after the U.S. combined. Now, the budget has increased throughout the years, and the voice of critics has gone unheard.
We have our controlled news media in the country. Back whenever Ronald Reagan was president, he deregulated telecom. And at that time, we had over 153 independent news outlets, media outlets. That is consolidated down to 6. And those 6 are all marching in lockstep. They all have the same message all the time. That is why you don't see the outrage, because the news media does not emphasize what's going on.
According to the Washington Post, in 2019, America's military budget is set to grow for a 5th consecutive year to near historic highs in 2020, as lawmakers push increases in defense spending for next year, despite opposition from some liberals in Congress and deficit hawks.
At the time now, the Democrats wanted a smaller increase, but regardless, the U.S. is now spending more on its military than at any point since the Second World War, except for just a few years on the high point of the war on Iraq. It is interesting that despite the massive spending, a 2018 report by the Pentagon in connection with the White House stated that all facets of the manufacturing and defense industrial base are currently under threat, and claimed that some entire industries within the military supply chain are near extinction.
Would the U.S. be better off spending less money on the military? Absolutely. And again, I go back to the military contractors and how they do business. The U.S. spends 10 times more than the next 5 countries combined annually on the military. And we don't have the largest military as far as number of people, but we do have the most expensive weapon systems. And many of these weapon systems simply do not perform to standard. The Russians, on the contrary, spend 10% of what the U.S. does on weapons platforms, and their stuff is state-of-the-art. It's highly functional, works better than anything the U.S. will generate. They overcomplicate things by design because these require constant upgrades, constant maintenance, and that's a revenue stream for these military industrial contractors. The Raytheons, the Boeings, the Northrop Grummans, the Bath shipyards, all of those people that profit off of our military. And it has become, like I said before, the U.S. is based on a wartime economy. And that's why these things are there, so to keep the profitability of these defense contractors.
The United States is losing the wars and destructions it has caused around the world. The most recent example is Afghanistan, that left them no other choice than to retreat.
We need regime change in the U.S. We need a complete new set of governing people and governing principles. The U.S. has sold itself out. Greed has taken over. The politicians are for sale. The defense contractors are for sale. The lobbyists make their money by persuading politicians to do things that are not in the interest of the American people. And that really seems to be the number one reason why the U.S. is failing, not just in those areas, but in every area. We are, at this point in time, failing as a country. This is just a tip of the iceberg. The American people, we don't trust anything.
Some domestic critics of overspending in the military say that by cutting military costs, America could fund a universal childcare policy, extend health insurance to the millions of Americans who lack it, and provide significant investments in the country's infrastructure without increasing taxes on ordinary citizens.
The FBI, which was originally put together to investigate bank robberies, now is the greatest sponsor of domestic terrorism. They have turned toxic against the United States. The same could be said for the CIA, which is supposed to be an intelligence gathering network overseas. CIA is active in this country, working against American citizens. Same for the NSA. All of our systems have turned into a command and control system against the American people to extract as much money out of us as possible without inciting a revolution organization at this point in time. And the criminals have tightened their control over every facet of the American government. And the American government is tightening its control over every facet of American life. And so when we say we are a free country, freedom is only an illusion in this country. You're not free in this country anymore.
This is unlikely to happen, however, because the U.S. has to first stop meddling in the affairs of other nations, nations whose corrupt officials and representatives fail to put national interests above their own. U.S. politicians earn a great deal of money both themselves and through their election campaigns from arms companies, which makes it that much harder to imagine that without enough pressure from the public, they would ever abandon the business of killing people abroad anytime soon. Well, that was our show, everyone. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Daniel Arya. Do join us again next week on another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.